When you gather sources for your papers, evaluate those sources according to authority, content, currency, and context. Let's discuss authority. You want to make sure that whatever source you use, that source has authority on your topic. So when you first present that source in your paper, you always want to indicate the full name of your source and one relevant professional credential that makes that source an authority on your topic. That's very important because it's a support issue. If you do not mention the relevant professional credential that makes your source an authority on the topic, readers will have less confidence in the information that you're presenting from that source. So I don't need to know the educational credentials of your source, just the one relevant professional credential. Even if it's an organization, you need to give some information that proves that that organization has authority on the topic. And also ask yourself, is your source well respected in the field? And finally, just as an overview, think of this question. Is this source likely to impress readers of my paper? You always want to find impressive sources, as that affects the confidence in your support. As I mentioned before, you want to establish your source's authority when you first mention him or her within your paper. So something like this signal phrase, according to behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman. So you see how the relevant professional credential of that source was placed before the name? Sometimes you can do it after the name and the full name was given. Dr. Martin Seligman, who directs the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania, conducted a study. So do you see a relevant professional credential? Let's say you're using a newspaper article and the author is a journalist. So that journalist is not an expert in your topic, so it's not an authority. But perhaps the journalist is mentioning the expert in his or her article. In such a case, you would cite the expert within your sentence and include the journalist's last name at the end of your sentence. So you're always trying to establish the authority of your source in a signal phrase of some kind within your sentence. Content is also very important when considering what sources to use. You want to be aware of bias, sources that are slanted to one side or the other. Sometimes a source may say that it's objective, but when you look at the content of it, maybe most of the information or all of the information is to one side and not the other, and you need to be aware of that. Try finding mostly objective sources. That way your target audience, the reader for your paper, will have more confidence in that source because they won't perceive it as biased. It's always great to use primary sources because they are the information itself and without anybody commenting on it. On the next slide, I'm going to explain what the difference is between primary and secondary sources. Basically, I'm just going to show you a video that does a good job of explaining that. It's okay to use opinion sources as long as it's very clear and upfront that the source is an opinion source, and also that you balance it out with an opinion source to the other side. For one thing, you want to be more well informed of the issue, and so if you read only opinions on one side, you're not going to be more well informed. And also, the reason it's good to kind of balance it out is because, again, the reader for your paper is going to have more confidence if they perceive your information as balanced. So click on the next page and click in the middle of the slide to see a video that does a good job of explaining the difference between a primary source and a secondary source.
Let's say you have an assignment that requires both primary and secondary sources. How do you identify those, and where do you find them? Chances are that you're familiar with a variety of primary and secondary sources and use them in everyday life. However, locating primary sources about an academic topic can sometimes be difficult. So what are primary sources? Primary sources are first-hand accounts of an event and are created during the time that event took place. They can also be created retrospectively at a later date by a participant in those events. They are original documents and usually don't describe or analyze other documents. They can also be creative works. Some examples of primary sources are speeches, laws, and court documents, diaries, memoirs, autobiographies, and letters, works of art, novels, and plays, documented observations, interviews, original research, and data, and historical newspapers. So how can primary sources be used for research? They can be used as a focal point of a discussion about events. They can be used to back up claims or criticisms. They can be used as evidence for theories and research. And they can be used to gain historical perspectives on a topic. So what are secondary sources? Secondary sources are written by scholars or observers after the fact and interpret or analyze primary sources or events. These sources are at least one step removed from what they are describing. Some examples of secondary sources are textbooks, encyclopedias, essays, and reviews, magazine or journal articles which analyze events or ideas, and books which provide a summary of events or synthesize information from many primary sources. So how are secondary sources used? They can be used to get background information and understand the scope of a topic. They can be used to see what others have discussed or get opinions. You can use them to learn how recent events affect or fit into the larger picture. And they can help you understand the significance of events, data, works of literature, and art. Let's look at some examples of topics and primary and secondary sources that you can use. A primary source for a paper about Shakespeare's play Hamlet would be the actual play. This is the object that the paper is studying. A secondary source for this paper might be an article that analyzes or studies the play. A secondary source could also be a book or essay that analyzes or interprets the play, or websites that provide summary information about the play. Let's look at another example. A primary source for a paper about the placebo effect could be data from a medical trial which was published in an academic journal. Secondary sources for this topic could include books about medication, the placebo effect, and health in general, or websites which define various anxiety disorders. A primary source for a paper about social media and the news might be blog transcripts published on the web. The transcripts of the blogs represent the object that you're studying. Therefore, they're the primary source. The secondary source for that paper might be another article that analyzes how social media affects issues in the news, and books that provide background information and an overview of issues relating to social media and the future of journalism. One thing to keep in mind is that a source's classification as either primary or secondary can change depending on the topic that you're studying. For example, if you are writing about how the news is being represented on the internet, a news site like CNN might be considered a primary source. If you're studying news on the internet, CNN.com represents the object that you're studying. However, if you're writing about political elections and you find an article on CNN.com that analyzes them, the article would be considered a secondary source. Since in this case you're studying the elections, an article on CNN.com is one step removed from your topic. You can find more information about locating primary sources in the library's Guides and Help section of the website. If you have questions about using or finding primary and secondary sources, ask a librarian for help.
Try to make your sources as current as possible. I'm talking about your secondary sources now. Obviously, some primary sources oftentimes will be older sources because, for instance, if you were doing a paper on the First Amendment, you would quote from the Constitution, and of course, date is not an issue there. But secondary sources where you have a source that's writing about or discussing your topic, that those should be as recent as possible because things that were once considered facts often change. Statistics change. So it's really essential that your sources, secondary sources, be current. Finally, context matters. For example, whereas normally Wikipedia would not be a good source for a research paper or an academic paper, if you were writing a paper in which you're researching the difference between wiki sources and traditional encyclopedia sources, then of course Wikipedia would then be a primary source and perfect to use for your paper. So the sources you use and what you choose are going to be dependent on the context in which you're using them.